It's my very distinct pleasure to be able to introduce our plenary session being offered by the Office of Management and Budget related to uniform guidance. We have both Deirdre Harrison, who is the Deputy Controller of the Office of Financial Management, and Stephen Mackey, who is the Senior Policy Analyst, here to join us, and I will go through a little bit of their bios in just a moment. I know this will be a very interesting session. We already have a question in the Q&A to give you an idea of the anticipation that we have here. So Deirdre is a senior member of the OMB management team responsible for overseeing the Office of Federal Financial Management's diverse portfolio. This includes issuing government-wide policies through OMB circulars, bulletins, and memos, the uniform guidance, the other assurances. Prior to joining this office, she was a senior budget examiner in the Treasury branch at OMB, where her portfolio included a number of Department of Treasury bureaus and offices and branch-wide financial management policy areas. These included improper payments, shared services, and financial reporting and display. Prior to her federal career, Deirdre worked at an economic development consulting firm where she was an economist responsible for overseeing the design and implementation of large data analysis projects for clients to use in the courtroom and before regulatory agencies. She received her undergraduate degree in international politics and economics from Middlebury College and a master's degree in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Stephen Mackey, Senior Policy Analyst, works in the Office of Federal Financial Management at OMB. Prior to joining OMB, he worked at the State Department in a number of positions, including as a grants officer in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, and finally, the Bureau of Administration as the Director of Federal Financial Assistance Policy. Before joining government, Mr. Mackey worked for IREX in Moscow, Russia, over 10 years implementing State Department and USAID programs. He has a BA in Slavic Languages and Literature from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an MA from the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Please join me in giving them a warm, warm welcome to our FDP meetings.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming and for prioritizing listening to us today, but also thank you for sending us your questions. I really want you to be thinking while Steve and I are talking about what those questions are. Our only goal for today is to be helpful to all of you. And in order to do that, we need to hear from you where you want to hear more, where you want to go. And if we can't answer those questions today, we promise you we will get back to you in one format or another and get those questions answered. Now, I know what most of you, probably all of you, only really want to hear about are the 2024 revisions to the Uniform Grants Guidance. And I promise I'm not doing a bait and switch. But I do have a few things I want to make sure you're tracking in addition to all of the great work on the revisions. So I'll start there, and then I'll turn it over to the actual star of the show, Steve, who did all of those revisions, to walk through the revisions with all of you, and then we will open it up for questions. And so please do be thinking about those questions, and I promise I will keep my comments as limited as possible to give you as much time with the real expert as you can have. So first, I want to make sure you all are tracking, which I know that you are. The federal government continues to do a lot of implementing. In the last couple of years, there have been any number of large bills that have been passed, and lots of programs have been created. As part of that process, we have been laser focused on changing the way that federal agencies do oversight. What I mean by that is historically, we've been very focused on after-the-fact audits to make sure that did the right recipient get the right amount of money at the right time. But we learned during the pandemic, if we were waiting until after the fact, we have missed the opportunity to stop some of that fraud, waste, and abuse while it is occurring in real time. And so when this administration showed up in 2021, the first thing that they set out to do was to reestablish a close relationship with our oversight partners and figure out how we can bring them in on the front end. So that way we're not waiting for only the audit after the fact. We are learning from their expertise in the first instance during program design. How did we do that? through a variety of ways, but one that I'll highlight that has been particularly successful is what we call joint review meetings. Before a program that received a substantial amount of money as part of one of those bills that passed, or a program that was brand new was allowed to issue their first notice, we would hold a meeting. And that meeting would include representation from the program staff, the agency leadership, the agency's IG, myself and my team, as well as those at the White House who are otherwise interested in the program. Those conversations were game changers. We were able to just discuss with each other what are the risks, what are the challenges, and what are the opportunities. How can we work together to make sure, again, that we are getting the money to the right person at the right amount and at the right time. Those weren't audits, they weren't pre-clearance, we weren't asking the IG to bless the program design, but we wanted to make sure that we were learning the lessons that those IGs and others had experienced in prior programs. To date, I myself have hosted over 60 of those meetings in the last couple of years. But even more importantly, what we are now finding is that agencies are proactively reaching out to their IGs without the nudge of OMB and are having those conversations in the program design phase. That is what institutionalizing the lessons learned looks like. We need our agency partners working with their oversight programs to make sure that they have learned the lessons and aren't just waiting to the after-the-fact audit. We've also been partnering across Treasury, GAO, OMB, and OPM on a 3-year initiative focused on fraud, waste, and abuse and payment integrity in general. We've issued a plan. It's on CFO.gov. All of our agencies are working together to identify the ways to get agencies the tools they need to prevent improper payments in the first instance. One of the things that have come about as part of this are a series of fraud symposiums that we at OMB host. They are often over lunch. Our next one is actually today. And we bring in some sort of subject matter expert or a series of them to just share their best practices and lessons learned to apply. Right now, they tend to be only open to our federal partners on our monthly or bi-monthly cadence, but we've also done some larger ones that are open to the public. Again, you can get that information at CFO.gov, and I really encourage all of you to participate as you see fit, because those are the conversations where you are learning on-the-ground tactical ways to do the kind of oversight that really is required to make sure that recipients are able to spend their time doing the program, not just doing the administrative items. Another area where we've been closely coordinating with our oversight partners is in the single audit space and the compliance supplement in particular. I'm not going to get into all of the details about what we've done there, but I am proud of our team that we have now set ourselves on a new calendar where we are dedicated to getting that supplement out every May on time, so that way the audit community can have that information in hand before June. I was hoping that today I was going to announce that it was posted today, but I believe it will be posted before the end of the week. But this year's supplement is definitely on track to be done before the end of this month and is very, very close. And so that's just the new norm. 2 more things, and then I promise we're going to get to the Uniform Grants Guidance. First, the federal program inventory. If you don't know what the federal program inventory is, I'm going to encourage you all, after we are done, to go on your phones and type in fpi.onb.gov. Since 2013, the federal government has been tasked with creating a comprehensive list of programs that the federal government administers. Since 2013, we have failed to do that. Yes, OMB is here saying that we have failed to do a thing. We tried a couple of times, but we just couldn't quite crack the nut. We couldn't figure out how to get agencies to be talking in a way that was consistent, that the inventory was helpful to any of our partners or stakeholders in that inventory. Well, this year, I think it was about 3 months ago now, we launched the first federal program inventory with the help of our agency partners. We have used assistance listings, which I know many of you are aware of, but it's basically that number or marker where agencies have identified a program. And for each assistance listing, we've been able to provide publicly available information about those programs, including things like the authorizing statutes and how much money has been obligated in the last couple of years, who are the recipients, What kind of funding is it? That inventory, which again, I really do hope you all will check it out, is going to be iterated on and improved upon, but it is one of the ways that as the federal government, we want to make sure that not only are we communicating clearly with each other, so if one department needs to stand up a program, they can go and find similar programs, but if you as a recipient are interested in what kind of programs may be available for somebody like me, you have a place where you can go to learn that information in a quickly and easily digestible way. Like I said, we are going to iterate. There's certainly room for improvement, but that website is a really great start. So please check it out when you have time, fpi.onb.gov. And the last one before we get to the Uniform Grants Guidance, which is probably the most important, and I hope you all know before I say it that we have done this, but if not, today's the best day as ever to learn about it. In August, we rolled out a new council. That council is the Council on Federal Financial Assistance. It is really critical that as a federal government, we stop focusing on all of the differences that each program's underlying statutory authorities provide and start focusing on how we as a government can behave more consistently across all of these programs. Now, I know that every program has specifics, and this is not to say that we don't have to worry about that, but we do need to think about our recipients as thinking of us as one provider of federal financial assistance. So in August, we issued this memo, and we told each agency's deputy secretary to identify a senior accountable official for all grants at their agency. This was really critical because before that, there were lots of agencies where if I had a question about how that agency thought about grants management, I didn't know where to go. If I went to the CFO, they might know one sliver. If I went to the procurement shop in many of these agencies, they knew another sliver. But if I wanted to know anything about the program, I had to go find the individual program managers. That's not a really efficient way to share and to try and get consistency. So now we have 24 SFAOs from each of the CFO Act agencies. We've also asked our small agencies to identify a lead, and we have a person who goes to the small agency council to make sure that our smaller agency partners are represented. Since August, we have been very, very busy. One of the areas we have been focused on is making sure that as a collective, we are able to clearly articulate the operating environment for grants in the federal government. Before that council, I couldn't even name, never mind identify, all of the systems and processes that agencies had in place to do various parts of the process. That's got to change. We need to know if an agency is looking for a system, how can they share systems that currently exist? How can they make decisions in the same way that other agencies are making? We also knew that we had to focus on data standards. If we're going to be able to talk as one, we need to be able to talk as one in a technical way that is consistent. So much like the work that was done in the financial management space with Data Act and thinking about the data elements for how agencies can be reporting in a public way, we have been working to identify tranches of data elements that we will define so that way when we are asking questions of recipients, for example, your address or your zip code, we are doing that in one way all of the time. So you can be building systems that are easy to send the information because you know, regardless of what agency or what program is asking you the question, you know how to answer that, and it is always the same way every single time. None of this works, though, if we're not focused on our workforce. Today, it is often the case that if you get hired to be a grants management professional at an agency, you are hired and become very specialized in that particular program, but you don't necessarily gain the skills you need to transfer to other programs. And we need to be better at identifying the core set of competencies and making sure that our grants managers have them so that way they can more easily go from one agency or one program to the next. So that way with the ebbs and flows of new funding coming in and new programs coming online, we have individuals that can go there, but also individuals who are going to be making decisions and implementing the Uniform Grants Guidance in the same way. Which gets us to the last area that we've been super focused on, which is how exactly are we going to implement all of those changes that Steve made? And boy, did he make a lot of changes. So as a group, we've been thinking about lots of things, in particular, how much training and how much do we need to get out to folks. So Steve and I have been doing a lot of this. We have been coming to lots of groups, virtually and in person, as many as we can fit into our calendar, to make sure that you are hearing from OMB what changes we made and why. The why here is really critical because a lot of what we did was about clarifying, not making new policy. What we at OMB had been hearing over and over again over the last few years in particular is that individual programs were reading the same language in the Uniform Grants Guidance and making a different determination about how it should be implemented. Again, really smart people that were well-intended reading the same words, having a totally different conclusion is not something as the federal government we can continue. We need to be able to speak with one voice, and it shouldn't matter what program is answering the question, the answer needs to be the same. And so much of what we did was to rewrite the language in plain English. We wanted to make sure that you didn't need to actually be a lawyer to read it, and if the lawyers were interpreting it, there was much less room for misunderstanding or a difference in opinion. Well, that was all important, and it was certainly important for us because it was a lot of work for us to really understand how and why different agencies and different programs were interpreting differently. That wasn't our major goal. Our major and most important goal was to do what we could to review the guidance from top to bottom and understand how could we reduce administrative burden for recipients and for agencies. Now, while that was our goal, we knew that we needed to do that while also balancing the need for oversight. So where I started, it's not okay if where we land here is just reducing administrative burden that wasn't just burden and red tape, but was actually making sure that we had the appropriate oversight in place. And so that is how we spent much of our time over the last year, really thinking through how do we get that balance right. When can we increase a threshold or change a requirement and still get the outcome, which is that we know the recipient is actually performing the way that is required of them because of the underlying statute. We knew from the beginning that we weren't going to get it right on our own, and so for the last year, we've tried really, really hard to do as much listening as possible. And I will tell you, probably many of you in this room, but certainly many of you that you know have responded in kind and have given us lots and lots and lots of comments throughout this process. And we are undoubtedly convinced that because of those comments, we made the guidance document better. We were talking a little bit earlier about the preamble. If you haven't read it, I really encourage you to do so. But more importantly, when you have a question about a change that you're not sure what the intention was, to go look at that preamble. Because what we really tried to do was acknowledge not only what comments came in and why, but also a little bit of the logic about, are we just clarifying or are we changing policy? And that is really, really important. So, last month, we issued it. It hit the Federal Register. We are on track for agency implementation for all awards issued on or after October 1st. Steve is going to get into any number of the particular details. But before I turn it over to Steve, I do hope you all have questions, but I also want you to know that this is the start of the conversation and not the end. We know that while we have done the hard work to try and get the policy right in the guidance document, it is going to take all of you and all of our agency partners and recipients everywhere to help us get that implementation right. And we're going to ask you to hold us accountable to that. On October 1st, 2024, is everything going to be hunky-dory and perfect? No. But we'll come back next year, and we want to hear from you about what is working and what isn't working. What do we need to do better? What are the programs that maybe aren't implementing in exactly the same way so we can be course correcting over time? We at OMB are committed to this. The Council on Federal Financial Assistance, the COFA, is committed to this, but we can't do it in a vacuum, and so we're going to need all of you to continue to engage with us. So thanks again for listening, and now I'm going to turn it over to the real expert.
Thank you, Deidre, and thank you for having us today. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's great timing since, as Deidre just said, we published the uniform guidance revisions only recently on April 22nd. So Deidre and I have been on this, what we're calling the road show of updating everyone about some of the key changes we made. I am going to, Deidre's very kind to say Steve did all the changes, but it works both ways, because if something goes wrong, then you can get the blame for it. So it's a shared partnership. No, but really, first of all, I did have one very valued partner, colleague, Andrew Reisig, and he and I were largely driving the whole, the effort to engage with agencies, to engage with the public, to draft changes, to review responses to those draft changes. And you all played a valuable role, and I wanted to take the opportunity to thank you for your participation in this process. It was actually the first time that I've ever gone through this process as a federal employee of starting from scratch, getting the RFI, getting all that feedback, posting a draft for public comment and reviewing the comments and then making revisions from that. The process, as cumbersome as it may be, and it certainly makes the process go a little longer than one might want to, there's a lot of value in that, and we learned a lot from the feedback that we got. So I really appreciate your participation in that throughout. It really makes a difference. We want to make sure we get the guidance right. We know we can't give, we can't accommodate every request for a change that comes in. And oftentimes you'll see competing requests, right? If you accept one, then the other request is, it goes the other way. So we certainly sought compromise and solutions that were amenable to both the federal side and our partners. So I wanted to walk through today some of the key changes. There are too many, of course, to go into detail on every one of them. I do want to echo Deidre's suggestion to really look at the preamble. You probably don't hear a lot of people advertising the value of a preamble. I know it is an administrative requirement as part of the regulatory process, but in this case, we did a particularly thorough job pointing out, and it's very broken out section by section, about all of the changes we made and why, and including all the response to the comments that you have to provide, but really it just hones in on all the key changes. So if you want to reference a section that you're interested in and kind of say, what has really changed here, in addition to the red line, which shows the edits that were made, the preamble is a good place to go through. And obviously I can't go through all these changes today, but I certainly will be focusing on some of the key ones that we wanted to highlight, and we can get through some other ones perhaps in the Q&A. Now, I am not assuming that everyone here comes with the knowledge of how 2CFR is structured, and there may be some people that aren't even really that closely involved in 2CFR. I don't know. Probably many of you are intimately familiar with it, but just for kind of a scene setter, I wanted to provide just this quick kind of shorthand overview of how it's organized, just to start us off on this conversation today. These are kind of shorthand titles of each of the parts that are up there, so then they don't exactly match to the official title. But you see chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1 being the place where we put a lot of the guidance that is closely associated with some legislative requirement, usually, whether it's FFATA or the Trafficking in Persons Act, the now not really active American Rescue Recovery Act, but all of these live in Chapter 1. We touched all of them in some way, probably not as much in the suspension, debarment, and drug-free workplace, but all of them we read through and engaged with agencies on potential revisions to them. More so probably in 25, 170, and 175. And of course, Part 184 is an entirely new section, which, in case you missed it, was basically published maybe a month before we did this, or actually maybe even more than that. So that is a new part of Chapter 1, which addresses the Buy America preference and infrastructure projects. In Chapter 2, where really the 2CFR 200 lives, is where we focused a lot of our efforts. And so we made probably the vast majority of changes on that side in Chapter 2. Slightly less in Subpart F because of its close alignment with the Single Audit Act. There was only so much we actually have the authority to change, so we focused more on clarifications rather than actually changing policy in Subpart F. So I hope that's helpful just to kind of start us off and acquaint us with the landscape of 2CFR as we walk through some of the key changes today. So before I go through like part by part, and I'm not going to go through each and every part in Chapter 1, I'm going to hit just some of the key changes, so don't worry. But some of the general changes that we tried to make, as Deidre was saying, we want to make this more accessible, more comprehensible. We want the average, just the layman, to be able to understand and say, okay, this applies to me or it does not apply to me. In some cases, just to very generally, the name of the guidance itself is kind of slightly outdated. In grants and agreements, yes, most of it does apply to grants and cooperative agreements rather than loans and insurance and other forms of federal financial assistance. But broadly, it applies to federal financial assistance. So we've changed the title and changed references to the guidance that said previously grants and agreements. And more meaningful is we replaced non-federal entity with recipient and subrecipient. It's a little more cumbersome in places to read since it's more words technically, but it allowed us the ability to really focus on each and every use of the term non-federal entity and question anew the application of that guidance to either a recipient or a subrecipient or both. Now, it may have been clear in 75% or even 90% of the situations, but we definitely encountered parts of the guidance where it was clear even to us. It was not clear even to us at the outset whether this really did apply. So with legal counsel participation, and federal engagement, we really wanted to make sure that we got each and every use of that. So by using recipient and subrecipient in a very targeted way, we think we've done a lot to clarify the application of the guidance. The non-federal entities, some people had questioned why it's retained in some aspects of the guidance. It's not a full-scale replacement. We didn't eliminate the term, and that is largely because when legislation was drafted, and the Single Audit Act is a good example of that, it uses non-federal entities. So we can't just suddenly apply that to recipients broadly, or you would then be folding in like for-profit organizations, companies under the Single Audit Act, and they're not applicable. So we did retain the use of non-federal entity in some cases. Federal agency pass-through entity, or we also, again, just as I mentioned with subrecipient and recipient, we looked through each and every use of that term and made sure that the guidance was correct, and did find some examples where improvement could have been made, and we made those changes to make the guidance more clear in terms of applicability. So that's just kind of general. Now, in terms of Chapter 1, and you remember from the first slide, those are the parts that were to the left of the screen, dealing, again, with FFATA, Buy America, et cetera. These are just a few of the examples. One of the key ones that we made in Part 25, which is related to the UEI, and this may not be as great interest to domestic organizations, but we're allowing a new exception in SAM.gov for foreign entities for up to $500,000 to be relieved of completing full registration in SAM.gov. And that was very important for partners such as State Department, USAID, some USDA programs that work with foreign organizations. We were limited to the extent that we could provide relief on obtaining a UEI, because FFATA does require it no matter what for anything above $25,000, but we made that change to offer a little bit of relief for our foreign organizations. In Part 175, which addresses the trafficking in persons provision, we did a lot of work on that. It's gotten a little longer, but it's gotten, I think, it's more clearly stated, because prior to these revisions, all of the policy was pretty much focused on the actual provision which is provided in 175. Now we have added more, like a section in the beginning which actually explains the policy, and then the provision follows. So we just took the opportunity to update it and make sure that it was fully in alignment with the Act, which undergirded the part itself. And there had been amendments to the Act since the guidance was released and Part 175 came into being, so we were able to update it and align it more closely with the amended version of the Trafficking in Persons Act. All right, now we get to myriad changes, and I hope you do not go to sleep. Luckily, it's still somewhat early in the day. I'm not going to go through each and everything on these screens, but they're here for your reference, so we can at least look at them even if I don't talk to all of them. But for the acronyms and definitions, just to start out in Subpart A, one of the things we looked at is, and this is not a massive change or anything, but we just looked at cleaning up the acronym section. There were acronyms for agencies in some parts, other agencies were absent. There were acronyms that were in frequently used throughout the guidance that were not listed there. So we did a cleanup of that. And then the definitions, our basic mission here was not only to revise some of the definitions themselves, but to look at how the definitions were used. Like what is the point of this definition section? It should be, we felt, defining those terms that are used frequently throughout the guidance. But in other parts where a term is introduced and it only lives in that one short section, we felt it was actually better for the reader to see the definition in the context in which it's used. In other words, defining it in whatever subpart it just shows up in, rather than having the reader read the section and say, oh, there's a term, I gotta flip back to the definitions, find out what it means, then go back to the text and read it. So we tried to make sure that those definitions that were provided in subpart A really were those that were used frequently throughout the guidance. And we've changed many of them. I'm not going to go through each and every one, but probably some of the big ones that, because these threshold increases are throughout, but they've kind of first show up in subpart A, is we've increased the threshold from, for equipment and unused supplies from 5,000 to 10,000. And of course that is reflected in the definition. Similarly, we looked at all the thresholds and increased most of them where we could. The threshold for subawards that you can draw indirect from. Before it was you can draw indirect off the first $25,000 of subawards that the pass-through entity is issuing, and now that has been increased to $50,000. So that is another, I think, a change that was necessary given the passage of time since the threshold was established. We've added a new definition for participant. This is, again, an example of some of the helpful engagement that we have with agencies and with you throughout. And we've updated other definitions as well. Again, I'm not going to walk through each and every one of them, but there's just a few of the examples there. Moving on to subpart B, this kind of gets back at, again, the use of the terminology in terms of how this guidance is interpreted. And we really took a good look at the use of the word like in relation to recipient and subrecipient. When the word or is used between the terms, any requirements apply to the recipient, the subrecipient, or both, and this is really should be clear from the context of the sentence. The applicability table, some people loved it, a lot of people did not. This was a tough one. The authors, shall we say, of these revisions found it sometimes personally somewhat confusing, so we hope we have improved on it. We've just basically converted it to paragraph form, rather than saying, okay, this column says it does not apply to what, types of entities, et cetera. So it's in text form. We didn't make myriad changes to the policy of applicability. As I said at the outset, the fact that we call it now federal financial assistance in the title, the applicability table always stated, what applies to loans and insurance, et cetera. So the overarching policy has not shifted. There are a couple of changes that we made in terms of, one example would be for fixed amount awards. Previously, it was stated that subpart E does not apply at all, so the cost principles do not apply at all. We have changed the policy to reflect that the underlying principles of the cost principles, allowability, allocability, et cetera, do apply to fixed amount awards, even if the select items of cost do not. So we've changed the applicability to reflect that. Another slight adjustment we made was for grants that issue food commodities. Again, it said previously that subpart E did not apply at all. But in fact, what we learned from working with our agency partners is that, especially USDA, is that some grants that issue food commodities also have activities in them. And so it's really that the subpart E does not apply to the food commodity portion of the grant. So those are a couple of examples of some tweaks that we made in that section. One that has gotten a lot of attention and we're really proud of is reviewing the policy on the use of English language. There are a lot of communities in the United States, whether working with Puerto Rico, with certain communities in any of our urban areas where another language is perhaps more convenient to actually work and get the work done between the federal agencies and the recipient. And so And of course, overseas, I have a lot of experience working with international partners in Russia, for example, working directly with Russian organizations and insisting that everything we do be in English because 2CFR requires it. It didn't make any sense for certain programs. So we've released that kind of strict rule that you submit all reports and all notices, et cetera, in English and allow now for the use of languages other than English. And this has been received with great appreciation, if I do say so myself, because it makes sense. The other part, and I'll wrap up general provisions, is the mandatory disclosures. We have made some changes there as well. We worked very closely with the oversight community in drafting revisions to this section to make sure that it was in alignment with the federal acquisitions regulations. So now there is pretty much a one-to-one match in terms of the policy of mandatory disclosures in 2CFR and that of the FAR. All right, you're still awake. Thank you very much. Just a few more to go. You can see the letters moving along. We're now on C, and it only goes up to F. So maybe it'll be G and H soon by the time we get done with that. I don't know. Subpart C, I've already mentioned fixed amount awards and the changes that we made there in terms of the applicability table, so I won't go back into that. But one thing you'll notice as you go, and this is not just focused on Subpart C specifically, but really throughout, you'll see a theme of the importance, and this really speaks to you, the recipients, many of you that is, the importance of federal agencies partnering with not only the recipients, but the communities in which you're doing the work that you do. May not apply to all of the programs that you're involved with, but we really wanted to underscore that if federal government is to develop programs that are impacting a community in some meaningful way, that the community should be able to speak to the development of that program and also on the back end for the evaluation, underscoring the importance of reviewing what worked well and what didn't. So we really underscore the importance of not only partnering with communities, engaging them, but also underscoring the importance of federal agencies talking to each other. If they're administering programs that are similar, I'll just use again the state USAID example because it's closer to my personal experience. Many programs kind of overlap in terms of the overall purpose of the program. So we're encouraging federal agencies to reach out across to their partners in the federal government to share best practices and approaches that have worked well for that particular program and make sure that they're talking to each other before they put out their NOFO. Now the NOFO changes, there are many, and they are reflected not only in Subpart C, but also in Appendix 1, which is the appendix. I should have probably mentioned that when I had that first slide up. We didn't redraft all of the appendices. We know there's work to be done in the indirect for a future update. There's those appendices that will be like for a new project. But Appendix 1, we revised completely, and also, of course, in Subpart C, there are a couple of principles that we're looking at there. One is to emphasize, just as we adopted the aspirationally at least, writing as much as we can in plain language in 2CFR, to also encourage federal agencies to be using plain language in their notices. I know there are some complex programs, certainly many research scientific programs where an OFO is going to be complicated and you can't do anything about it. But we're really hoping that the federal government writ large can review anew the NOFOs that may have been in circulation for years, and that they just update them every several years to recompete the program, but don't really step back and say, is this necessary? Do we need these 10 attachments to it? Can we just put a link in there instead? Are we explaining it well in 10 pages, or can it be explained better in fewer pages? So that's a whole different effort that OMB is also taking on to work with federal agencies to review the notices of funding opportunities and strive for a simpler and more direct way of communicating. And then some of the others that I wanted to highlight are diversity of reviewers and merit review panels. And the only new section that we added, we tried not to mess up the numbering of 2CFR. That was done in 2020 where we inserted a 202 on program design, and the whole thing, you had to change every single number that followed, at least in Subpart C. So we really took efforts to not mess with the overall organization and structure of 2 CFR, given the number of revisions we had to make. We left that alone. So we tucked this in right at the end of Subpart C since it is new. This is not necessarily new policy. It was contained in the national policy requirements, but it's more clearly stated in terms of whistleblower protections and the requirement to inform workers of them. So, moving on to D, we made some clarifications in national policy requirements as stated. We've updated internal controls to reflect the importance of also considering cybersecurity measures. And looking to reduce burden, as Deidre had highlighted, are allowing for more flexibility on the part of federal agencies in terms of disposition of equipment. There are some cases where perhaps the requirements of disposition are not as important for that particular program, and so just the allowability of a little more flexibility in that regard. The thresholds, of course, I already mentioned when I was going over the definitions. And again, back to flexibilities, allowing Indian tribes to follow their own policy and procedures for procurement and equipment disposition, as states can right now, is another change that we made. And finally, on wrapping up D, you'll see the procurement standards have an entirely new section, like F, I think it is, or maybe it's I can't remember. But the changes that we made with regard to procurement in terms of not suggested, but rather examples of certain provisions that could be allowed for. This was really an effort to clarify. We've had a lot of questions over the years about the allowability of certain things in the procurement space. So when you read through that, you'll notice there's a lot of things added in there these are not requirements. They are just stating examples of what is allowable if that is in the interest of the recipient to do so. And in that space as well, this is not an addition, but it was a removal on this prohibition of a geographic preference, which had been added at some point in the 80s, I think, and it was, we thought, a good change to actually remove that and give more flexibility again for our recipient partners, rather than a requirement, which in some cases might not be in the best interest of either the recipient or the federal government. So those are some examples. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them. The emphasis on pass-through entities, this is an example of clarifications that we made. Not every change we made to the guidance, of course, was new policy. In many cases, we were simply trying to be clearer as to the policy that was in existence. And one example of that is just emphasizing that pass-through entities are responsible for subrecipient and contractor determinations. We've had a lot of questions about that, and we know that's a lively topic for many. So we hope that this guidance clarifies this policy. And then the fixed amount of subawards is another example of increased thresholds. Before, we had a threshold of up to the simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000. We're now allowing up to $500,000. So this is a doubling of the threshold. We explored removing it entirely, but we ultimately landed in a place which allows for larger fixed amount subawards. And by the way, we've also emphasized it was kind of clear, but not exactly stated, that when you go to read the fixed amount subawards section 200-333, that it states that the requirements that are contained in 200-201 apply to fixed amount subawards. So that was just an effort to clarify in terms of the rules that flow from fixed amount subawards. And then, of course, as it was on the screen for the definitions, but I can get into it, we've revised the termination section. It aligns a little more closely, actually, with the original termination provisions. The one thing we wanted to emphasize more clearly in these revisions is that federal agencies do have the ability to terminate a federal award if it is in their best interest, like it no longer meets their agency goals. But it must be clearly stated that that is possible in the terms and conditions. It's not just good enough to live in 2 CFR. They have to explicitly include that in the terms and conditions so that the recipient is aware that that is part of their agency policy and a potential for the program. And then finally, we're going to wrap up subpart E and F, and I will finally stop talking. I know I've said that about 3 times now. Deidre's looking at me like, come on, kid, get off the stage. We looked at, this is going again to our effort to reduce burden is eliminating some of the prior approval requirements for certain items of cost. A big one is, of course, the increased threshold for, or not threshold, but indirect rate, de minimis indirect rate from 10% to 15%. I think of all the changes that we made, this is probably one that has gotten the most attention. It's certainly, I think, a positive development for recipients that were using the de minimis. We think it is a more appropriate level to allow organizations to draw from the award money that can cover their overhead expenses, which is the point of it. And the fixed amount threshold for calculating indirect I already talked about. I think many in the university community will have noticed that the removal of this DS2 requirement, which was somewhat burdensome, we felt, for certainly universities that expressed that view in terms of the requirement to submit that together with their proposal for indirect rates, and so we removed that as well. And the evaluation of the pension costs, we also added some language just to clarify that if we're drawing unfunded pension costs from a federal award, they should be for employees that are tied to, that are associated with that federal award. It's fairly clear, but it was, I mean, it's kind of obvious because it's a basic allocation principle, but we stated that more directly in the guidance. The evaluation and data costs has gotten also a lot of positive attention. We included examples of data and evaluation costs that are allowable under federal awards. This is not a policy change from our perspective. A lot of people have kind of welcomed it as if, like, OMB is now, allowing data and evaluation. No, I mean, they were always allowable. We have simply provided the clarification that they are allowable and provided some examples of what kinds of costs they are. Those examples are not the only costs. It's very clearly, for example, the following, but that has been helpful for many recipients, states as well, on the use of federal awards to develop integrated data systems and data sharing for the purposes largely to benefit, the federal agencies that are designing programs and also, of course, the public that are benefiting from them. And one of my personal favorites, because this I always struggled with at the State Department in the policy space, was closeout cost. It was we always heard feedback from recipients on what kind of cost could be charged to a federal award to just close it out. So we're just allowing, before it was only printing and publication costs during the closeout period, but we're now stating that certain administrative costs are allowable as well if you are employing an accountant or a program officer to work on final reporting, et cetera. It's kind of logical that the award should be able to pay for that stuff. But they're associated only with those specific costs needed to close out the award. And finally, Subpart F, we didn't do a lot of policy changes to Subpart F for the purposes I stated previously, which is that it is in alignment with the Single Audit Act, so there's only so much we can do. However, we did have the authority to increase the threshold of whether you need a single audit or if a major program should be audited from $750 to $1 million. That is expending $1 million in the recipient's fiscal year. So that is a change that we made. Many of the other changes that we wanted to make or that were suggested, we simply couldn't because Single Audit Act. But this is one that is going to be in effect. And I already mentioned Appendix 1, of course, when I was talking about NOFOs. This is where the template is contained. And so we've restructured that with the purpose of providing a more clear and thorough list of the requirements that should be included in a notice of funding opportunity. So that's a lot. Now, I know just hearing my voice kind of grow weary from speaking, I know it must be equally hard to receive all this information and internalize it, but I hope it was helpful to hear some of the main changes. Again, we weren't able to address, obviously, all of them that we made. Tried to pick ones that we thought would serve as good examples, not only of important changes, but also reflecting, the approach that we took to this and the intent of those changes. And so please do look over, of course, the preamble and the red line to get into the whole list of everything that we did. But those are the big ones. And I think we're on to questions now. So thank you for bearing with us as we went through all of that. I know it's a lot. I'm including contact information for a main just grants mailbox that everyone monitors, so you can drop a question in there. I do want to say, though, that we're leaving business cards up here. My stack is a little bigger, so I think you'll have to rush to get Deidre's, because, no, they're both here at the top, so we really take our contact information, and feel free to reach out to me directly with any specific questions if we can't answer them today, because we're limited a little bit to what extent we can answer on the fly, like specific policy interpretations of some section. It's helpful to have that language in front of us. So there may be things that you want to ask or that you do ask that we can't quite answer specifically, but we want to take those back or encourage you to submit them to our general mailbox or to me personally. So with that, I will stop talking, and these questions can either be for me or Deidre, depends on what they are. And you are going to, one of you is going to moderate. Do you probably have them?
I guess we'll,
Okay.
both of us.
We do. I can start us off, and we'll take turns. This is voted the top question, because they can vote on questions. Can institutions begin submitting proposals now wherein the budget applies the increased equipment and subaward thresholds, provided the institution doesn't apply the new thresholds to awards prior to 10/1/24?
So this is a little bit in the pre-decisional space, but we are going to have supplementary implementation guidance going out, which you may recall from those of you who have been around, from the revisions that were made, well, not the revisions, from the launch of the uniform guidance at the tail end of 2013, we came out with a whole series of FAQs. We are going to do something not quite similar to FAQs, but additional information on implementation questions such as these. In general, if the award is issued, if the award is issued after October 1st and 2 CFR then applies, anything that precedes that, if it's an application for it, certainly could contain the higher threshold. In other words, if you're talking about submitting an application and it has, equipment and it at a higher threshold, but if that NOFO, one of the things we're going to be communicating to agencies as well, NOFOs that are going out before this guidance comes into effect, but that will result in awards that are issued after October 1st, should be speaking in general that the new guidance will apply. And so any application information that feeds into that resultant award should align with the updated guidance. If we're talking about indirect, in terms of the application of indirect rates, we're going to get more information on the application of that, but it will largely, also another thing, it will largely align with that which was issued in the same kind of principles that accompanied the release of the uniform guidance in 2014.
Thank you.
All right, the next question. We're having a conversation at our institution. Does the changing uniform guidance trump guidance that is in the NICRA, such as equipment value under the definition of MTDC?
So, sorry, does the uniform guidance trump the definition in the existing guidance? I don't know if I fully understand the question. I mean, in terms of once the new guidance is implemented and effective, then any awards that go out from the federal agency after that, the new guidance is in effect. But I guess I'm not quite getting
I think I can clarify
trumping
for you.
it, yeah.
So there's another question sort of along these lines. When you're talking about changing thresholds within uniform guidance, that's kind of a directive, right? But each institution negotiates our indirect cost rate agreement with our cognizant agencies, which include things like what is our equipment threshold? What are we mutually agreeing on? Mm-hmm. So there was that question. They're saying, so which one do we follow? I think I know the answer, but I'm going to let you answer.
Well,
and then somebody else asked, is there a way to have the cognizant agencies like blanket approve changes like that, like a change in thresholds?
Well, for the most part, for indirect specifically, what is likely, again, this will come out in supplementary guidance, it will be for new proposals that are submitted after the effective date. That's when all of those new thresholds and MTDC definition, et cetera, go into effect. So if you have an existing, I guess I'm finally maybe honing in on the answer, but if you have an existing indirect rate that was negotiated with the prior
Right,
rules
and
in effect,
equipment
that
rate
should,
threshold.
that's reflected in the rate itself. So it should be, that should be maintained per the old guidance, like the rate was negotiated with the old guidance, so the rate is what it is for that. But then when you have a new proposal going in, then the changes would take effect.
So does that go along with a person's question about, is there a way just to have a blanket, anybody that elects to change their thresholds, to have the cognizant agencies just do mods in a blanket fashion, or do each of us have to we're going to have to go back and talk to our cognizant agents?
You would ultimately have to go back. I mean, the
That's
thing
what I-
is like, I understand we're fully aware that if, for example, you have negotiated a rate, just 6 months prior to the release of this guidance, then it's locked in for 5 years, you kind of, just have a new rate and then the guidance changes and maybe your rate could have been improved from that. But there really is, we have to be careful about, one, the burden on federal agencies that are also sometimes frankly struggling with getting these rates out on time to then get a sea of requests for revisions. And this was the same policy really in 2014, if I recall, that they just said when your new proposal comes in, the guidance will take effect. But we're still working on supplementary guidance, so we will get out more clear information on that. There's lots of myriad scenarios that I know you probably have in mind and want answers to, but we're going to be getting a lot of these implementation responses out soon.
Great.
Is that Gene Feldman?
Yeah, let's
Oh, you didn't have to do that, just
so let's move to our audience. Jean, go ahead.
thank you. I know you, Steve. We've worked together for a long time.
Yes.
How are you? And really just a softball comment. I wanted to fully recognize that you couldn't incorporate everything, but something you did not mention but alluded to was participant support costs. And you made the change to allow childcare costs as an allowable cost. And you know what? For some of our awards, that's huge because it's the difference between someone being able to participate in a program or not. So I just wanted to congratulate OMB on what I believe is a significant change. Thank you.
That truly was a softball. No, thank you. Actually, and we'll go back and add that to the slides. The next time we do this, that'll be what I'll start out. The biggest change we made was, there are lots of valuable and positive changes that we're quite proud of, and that's a good one. Thank you for recognizing that. I appreciate it.
I do want to remind everyone they can go to the microphones to ask questions. Here's a question that is not a softball question, but it's on many people's minds. Are these efforts vulnerable to a possible change in the administration with the upcoming election?
No, you're good.
So I'll take this one. These changes were made based on what makes sense and getting that balance right between oversight and burden. This was not a political exercise. This was intended to be clarifying guidance and reviewing thresholds and looking at what has changed since 2013 and then in 2020. This wasn't thought to be a Biden administration update that should necessarily be undone or changed if there is a change in administration.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's a question. There are extensive FAQs in existence for the uniform guidance. We rely on them. Are they still applicable, and can we continue to rely on them?
Yes and no. So
Yeah.
some of them have been totally outdated and undone and are no longer correct based on our current guidance. And so we will be reissuing the current FAQs kind of cleaned up. But we will not necessarily be adding to them in the way that some of you may like, in terms of just adding a bunch of new questions to answer new issues in the current guidance. As Steve has alluded to, we think there are probably more helpful ways to get you that information. And what we have found with that current FAQ is that many recipients and agencies don't actually use it and just come to us and ask us the same questions, and then we're pointing them back to the document, and it is this really horrible cycle. And so we are thinking through lots of different tools that we were planning to put out. Steve mentioned cfo.gov. I would encourage all of you to go there. Right now we have a dedicated page. That is where we will be continuing to update information until later this summer when the Council on Federal Financial Assistance website goes live, and then we'll port it all there, and that'll be the new permanent home. But we're going to put up a lot of information. I would not expect that the FAQs are going to, double in size. Instead, we'll replace them with an appropriate set of FAQs based on what has changed in the guidance, and then there'll be other kinds of information to get you those kinds of answers.
Great. So the next one is not a question, but it's more of a comment, and actually it's even more of a compliment. So, and this is from a procurement perspective. Thank you for removing the requirement to analyze profit in non-competitive procurements. Companies who are not traditional government contractors never provided it. So kudos and thank you from Tom Youngs.
Of course.
So there was one comment that, this isn't a softball either, so, regarding that there was some language changes from what was released versus what was sent out for public comment, and I asked them for an example, and I think the example that I received had to do with, and you actually just mentioned this, at the end of the fixed award amount period, there was new language added that says, and that all expenditures incurred in accordance with 200.403, which essentially kind of makes it sound like they're still accountable for the costs, allowability, or things like that. Whereas usually with fixed price, once you do the upfront analysis, you can rely on it being paid based on a fixed amount and not cost analysis. So it might just be an interpretation here, but I think it'd be worth talking about.
Well, for starters, I would encourage you to look at the preamble first, right? So that is what the preamble does. It explains from the public comment period to the final what changes we made and why, and the comments that came in and what were some of the influencing factors to where we landed.
The other thing to add is that the fixed amount awards, they were a new award instrument, new type of award in the initial guidance. A lot of agencies are still actually have themselves have questions on what is the appropriate way to issue these and what are the rules that apply. We thought that there was some nebulous aspects of that section. In our minds, the cost principles in fact that it said negotiated using the cost principles, the basic like allowability and is it necessary for the program, those always applied to fixed amount awards. It's not a free-for-all that you just, now it's anything remaining that was not used to support the program. Yes, you can keep that money and it's not considered a profit, et cetera. That still applies. But this is just a statement at the end that says that anything we spent on the program was used in the principle of allowability and allocability, et cetera. So we don't see that as actually a market shift or anything that should make anyone nervous. It just provides a little more clarity, and we actually are still going to be doing some more work in fixed amount awards on the implementation side, and we work closely with the oversight community who is interested in this topic as well, and are committed to working internally across the federal government to make sure that agencies are all in alignment and we can fully make sure that we're all working on the same page, and in future updates we perhaps will offer even more specificity to this. But the intent of these changes was not to upend the way fixed amount awards are processed, more to provide clarity.
So here's another question on clarity. Can there be clarification on issuing subs to for-profit entities using the de minimis rate that don't have a federally negotiated rate?
So subawards to for-profits and the use of the de minimis. I think that is one that I'd probably want to not just try to answer on the spot, but get back to. In fact, I will go back and take this on and try to get back to the sender. If you want to submit an email to the box, I would be glad to answer it there, but I do want to just think about that a little more, look at the language, and make sure I'm providing the correct answer.
Our lawyers would kill us.
Yes, sorry I have to do that, but
No, we understand. We understand.
This is an FDP type of question. So can FDP work, that's for us, on sharing information about how institutions are negotiating off-cycle changes to the NICRA to accommodate the increased thresholds on equipment and subawards?
Yeah, I'm
So one of the
Punch
things
on that,
we were
too.
talking about at the beginning of this conversation is that I would love to figure out the right way for the FDP to engage with the COFA, the Council on Federal Financial Assistance. This would be a great topic for us to cover. We are meeting all of the time internally, and I think this is a great topic to kind of go a little bit broader and maybe partner with you all on. So we're happy to take that offline
Thank
and
you.
have that conversation.
you.
Sounds wonderful. We'll
Wonderful.
follow up, definitely.
And there's a question at the mic.
Hi, I'm with NASA. My question is involving no-cost extension language, and wondering if OMB is going to be providing any implementation guidance to the agencies on implementing it. The reason I'm asking this question is RIG recently complained that we would grant no-cost extension requests that were received later than the 10th day of an award. And so my question is, did you really mean it to be punitive? Don't grant the no-cost extension if the request is late? Or whether it really, you uses the word should rather than shall. Did you mean it a should or a shall?
Yeah, but as we stated, I think in the preamble and perhaps in the guidance itself, if I recall, a should is very deliberate. It is not a must. In fact, we tried not to use shall, except I think it's retained in Part 180 or 182. But should and must, two different things. There are some areas of the guidance where, you can't just be nebulous and say, do it sometime before, or do it sometime after. And, 10 days is provided. It's really more of a best practice. We are not trying to limit flexibility in certain situations. There are myriad scenarios where no-cost extensions could be granted much closer to the end of the program, and that was never the intent. And hopefully we'll be able to. I don't know about issuing, an FAQ kind of thing, as Deidre was saying, but this is where we have to work with federal agencies. There are lots of questions that I'm sure you're not asking or not going to ask that we already have identified as areas that we need to focus on with the COFA to make sure that Deidre mentioned the workforce development, make sure that grants officers are all working together, and the IGs are working with us to understand kind of the processes that flow from the guidance that we're putting out. But we can't always state it in the guidance that it becomes an instruction manual on how to do work, and that can be limiting, confining in its own way and have negative consequences. But the implementation efforts should happen beyond the written word and with more cooperation, thanks to the COFA being stood up.
Steve, David Hollingsworth, Texas A&M. I just want to address something that you said and just make sure I'm clear on this. This was on the thresholds for the going up to $50,000 for your subawards and $10,000 for equipment. And we're preparing proposals now that will probably be, awarded in 9 months to 12 months. And I think I understood you say that we could go ahead and use those new thresholds in budgeting for proposals now, as long as they were going to be awarded after October 1st.
Yes.
We have gotten some feedback from various F&A consultants who were in touch with DHHS that saying that because our rate agreement used those old thresholds, and we're not asking to change our rate agreement, but that they're basically saying that we would need to wait till our rate agreement comes up for review. I just want to see what OMB's intent was. If it's your intent for us to start using those thresholds now for anything after October 1st, and that's a little bit different than we're hearing, but I welcome what you're saying.
That's helpful. That's helpful feedback. We can take that back internal to the COFA as well and make sure we are all aligned. At the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, there are going to be instances where agencies or programs are maybe still making decisions on their own, and that's the kind of feedback we need. So we will take that back, and we can come back to you on that.
So just as a comment, it goes back to the NICRA, right? And does that rule over top of a change in the uniform guidance, or that's why people are asking about mods? Somebody actually had a pretty good idea. I love the idea of FDP getting engaged in resolving this. Somebody suggested maybe we could talk to the cognizant agencies, and in the future, they could have their threshold saying as defined by OMB. And then they don't have to change it. It would just kind of float with whatever the current So that's an option that we will certainly think about.
That's helpful.
Pamela.
Thanks. Pamela Webb from Minnesota. I'd like to, for just a minute, go back and visit our favorite fixed amount subaward question again. I think there's good understanding in the community that when one is pricing fixed amount subawards, it needs to be based on the UG. And that's an expectation. It has been an expectation and would continue to be. I think the change that we're feeling in the new wording is that once we've priced it properly and once we've issued that fixed amount subaward, we're then basing whether or not we're making payments on delivery of the milestones that we've set in that fixed amount subawards. What we are not doing is analyzing individual items of cost after the fact, right, to determine whether or not that they are compliant. We just relying on that initial pricing to do that. And it's particularly important because we tend to use those with foreign subrecipients or small organizations where it is sometimes difficult to analyze the adequacy of their individual financial structures or the amount of time it would take to make that analysis would be difficult to achieve. And so the change in the wording makes us feel as though the requirement to then have the costs be compliant with DOT 403, for example, that has, brings in more of the background, makes us feel as though it's creating an expectation that we would need to be able to audit them to individual items of cost should that become necessary, or that we should have some kind of monitoring obligation or oversight obligation to look at individual items of cost after award to make sure it's compliant with the guidance. So it almost reverts it in a way to the cost reimbursement model. Was that the intent?
No. It is not the intent. The overarching principles and rules of working with fixed amount awards and subawards are not changing. And the intent, I think to some degree, one might be drawing conclusions, like you said, it feels like, or it seems like, that we are not changing the rules on, like, after you issue a fixed amount of subaward, you have to go back and analyze every cost that was spent and check off that it's, you're just attesting at the end of the program that all costs generally were used in support of the program and not to, do something else. That is the costs that were actually used on the program, not the remaining costs that were left over. So those overarching principles have not changed. We did not feel, I guarantee you when we were working on this, we were not like, aha, let's, silently change the meaning of this and, make them more stringent or rigid in some way. So we tried to be as clear as we could in the preamble to explain the intent, and let's go back and look at that language as well. Mm-hmm. And we'll, again, as we work with federal agencies on the implementation of this, do our level best to make sure that they're all reading it right, the IGs are, and that we reinforce that message in some way as we move forward. We'll keep, fixed amount awards and subawards are definitely something that are forefront on our kind of menu of options to keep a close watch for and make sure that they're being executed and interpreted and understood in the same way that we intended them to be and not in some other new direction.
That would be great. We'd really appreciate that because it allows us to bring into the research enterprise many more partners that we might not otherwise be able to do, and they're very valuable to the science. So we appreciate that.
No, we understand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a couple of technical questions that are in the Q&A online. First, since we know that submitting an incomplete current and pending support document could lead to prosecution under the FCA, does 200.13 require notification to the OIG if we have credible evidence that a faculty omitted a source of support?
That's one we'll have to take back. If you could email us that one, our lawyers will definitely want us to take that back.
And next is an FDP-specific question. If we get a request from someone within the FDP to provide more than what is required, there's standard language we send to respond, but they often push back. How do we respond? So I think I can interpret this. Many FDP institutions use our common forms, But sometimes our offices of counsel push back. Is there anything we can do to push back again to make sure that we can use the standard language?
I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't have any ready answer for like, this is the approach that you take in this given situation. I'm gonna have to think more on that one. I don't really.
I would say it like this, though, clarifying that we have the, responsibility to use the common terms would be very helpful, so that we have something that we can provide as, again, evidence of that acceptability.
Yeah, and I think, we tried to be as clear as we could, and we even give examples of common forms. There's a whole section on that we added language to in the uniform guidance. And, but we do encounter situations where somebody is asking for something that they should not be required. I used to review all sorts of grants files at the State Department, and I'm like, why are you doing this? Where did you get the idea that this is allowable? And that's where we need to get into the workforce development and training to reinforce the limits and not step over those boundaries.
That is very helpful, and I think that is a great place to conclude, and unless there are any other questions. Oh, there's a question that just came in. Will the responses to the questions that they have asked be emailed and be available to all attendees? I believe there's an archive of all of this that you'll be able to have in CVent. So, yes. And this has been asked throughout the day. All of the slides that are presented will be made available on our website after the meeting is over, so you will have access to that information.
Yes, and thank you. But I do encourage you to, even if you've asked a question, send it again to the, if you want another, like a clear answer, or you didn't quite get it, or maybe I didn't quite understand it correctly, to the grants mailbox, because not only do I want to give you the feedback appropriately and with the specificity that you need, but it also helps us understand where some of the pain points might be, and will be very useful in terms of developing further guidance and just supporting the workforce overall because this is going to be an effort to get this right as we roll it out and beyond October 1st. So these questions are really helpful for us as well.
We have one more question, if we have time. What is the enforcement mechanism to ensure prime awardees honor sub-awardees' negotiated rates? Sorry.
Yeah. So prime awardees are honored. So if you're a sub-recipient, right, then you are, and to ensure that the prime is basically not messing with the policy and issuing rates that are not compliant. It states in the uniform guidance that sub-recipients can inform OMB of any issues such as this. So I would say it's really an enforcement point, but you can bring that to our attention. For one, we don't want sub-recipients to feel that there is a wall between the federal government, and that we should be informed of any kind of shenanigans going on, because not only does it help us improve the guidance in the future, but it also helps us step in sometimes and rectify any situations that have arisen, and we've dealt with that over the years.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to remind you that there are 2 stacks of business cards for Deidre and Stephen, so please don't be shy after this session. Come and, pick up some.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Deidre.
Oh, you mean like in another year or something, or another?
I am so interested in hearing about your workforce development initiatives. I think that's just so great coming from OMB because that's like a big thing at universities as well. Like we're working on all sorts of ideas on how we're gonna get our people